Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Been waiting to get this guest back on here for a while. Luke Coffey is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he's one of my go-to guys about how to think about how the war in Ukraine is going and why it matters. Luke, welcome back to the Remnant.
Great. It's great to be back. It's always, I always enjoy our conversation. And I think this might be my third time on. So third time's a charm.
You're 2 away from getting the gold jacket.
I'll be looking forward to that.
So first of all, you were just in Ukraine briefly.
Yeah, that's right. A couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
What was the mood there? I mean, first of all, how's the war? I mean, you can take it any way you want to go, but how's the war going? And what do you say to people when they ask you, what the hell is Trump doing?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there, obviously. I was there, my timing was fortuitous because I had traveled through the south of the country, entered from Moldova to Odessa, which, if you imagine a map of Ukraine, it's in sort of like the lower left-hand corner, like the southwest corner of Ukraine, major port city. Went to Mykolaiv, another major port city that's been closed because of the fighting. Visited Kherson, which another port city, but this one is, just on the other side of the river from the Russian positions. It was part of a huge chunk of territory that the Ukrainians were able to liberate in 2022. And then from there, I went to Kyiv. By the time I got to Kyiv, the whole upper echelon of the Ukrainian government had just returned from Jeddah, where they had that first round of talks with Trump's national security team, mainly led by Rubio and Waltz. So it was interesting in that sense because all the views, all the conversations I had, these were fresh right off the thinking, right off the talks in Jeddah. So a couple of observations. I went there wondering if, after the debacle in the Oval Office, if the Ukrainians felt forced or bounced into, signing a minerals deal, meeting in Jeddah, suggesting a 30-day ceasefire. And honestly, I didn't get that impression at all. It was interesting because in many ways, the whole situation had moved on from the Oval Office incident. I was told by senior government officials that they had fantastic meetings in Jeddah, productive meetings in Jeddah, constructive meetings there, that Trump's national security team was genuinely interested in listening, engaging constructively. And this is probably, my interpretation of this is that this was two people, Waltz and Rubio, who we know are instinctively supportive of Ukraine, and they're in a room with Ukrainians thousands of miles away from J.D. Vance.
Mm-hmm.
So they probably reverted back to their type, right? So I have no doubt that they had constructive meetings in Jeddah, and I didn't get any impression that they were disappointed or felt forced by what happened in the Oval Office. And we could talk about that a little bit more if you're interested. But overall, my impressions were that the Ukrainians genuinely want a peace, but they don't want a surrender. And there's an important distinction there. And they want to make sure that they have future security guarantees. What this looks like is up for debate. I have my ideas on what this could look like in a realistic, situation that we find ourselves today with President Trump. But overall, I left the trip cautiously optimistic. And I should point out, too, that this was my fourth visit to Ukraine since the war started. So I have, some reference points from which I could, gauge or judge what the mood was like.
All right. So I want to circle back to some of that stuff, but just for the level setting purposes, imagine you're doing a quick briefing for a senator who's been in the hospital after a skiing accident or something, and he hasn't gotten an update in 6 months. How's the war going? Like, how would you assess it, absent the political climate? Like, just where do things stand? I know that March, I was listening to the Ukraine Latest podcast, my friends over there, and Dom Nichols was saying that March is shaping up to be the 5th worst month for Russian casualties of the war, which you could say sounds not bad or really bad. And then he says it's 40,000 Russian casualties in March, which is just staggering.
It's extraordinary. It is.
So, like, anyway, put it in. Give us a sense.
It's hard for our minds in America to it's hard for us to wrap our minds around this, because the Russians are suffering more casualties in a week, or in some cases less than a week, than we suffered in 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And it also shows the high tolerance of suffering that the Russian society is willing to take. It also shows how closely Putin has a lock on the narrative. And it also shows how effective Moscow's financial inducements have been. I mean, most of these people fighting in Ukraine, all these Russian soldiers are contracted.
Right.
They're paid quite handsomely on Russian standards, $2,000 to $2,500 a month, which is US dollars, which is a considerable amount if you're coming from Dagestan.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So Russia's spending a lot of money just on personnel because the Ukrainians have been so effective at, frankly, killing, or at least taking so many Russian soldiers off the battlefield. But if I could summarize the state of the conflict right now, it's one of largely stalemate, where neither side seems to be able to take the initiative in a decisive way that could lead to a strategic outcome. It's not on the Ukrainian side. It's not because of any lack of bravery or courage or ingenuity. It's because Biden and then now Trump have never been fully committed to a Ukrainian victory. They never gave the Ukrainians what they needed to win. Biden gave Ukraine what it needed to survive. And then on the Russian side, it's because of US and Western aid giving Ukraine just enough to survive that the Russians have been taking such high casualties. But they've been able to replace these numbers through their mobilization schemes, through their contracted recruitment. And we've not seen any major movement in the front line in almost 2 years. In fact, the Ukrainians advanced a bit into Kursk Oblast last August, which is part of the Russian Federation. They've since been squeezed out. Meanwhile, the Russians have taken some gains in Luhansk and Donetsk provinces, Oblast, as it's referred to in Ukraine, but at such a slow rate that if Russia continued to advance at its current rate, it would take more than 100 years for Russia to take the whole country. And you're also seeing signs of Ukraine making some tactical local counterattacks, taking back some of the villages that Russia paid a high price capturing to begin with. So right now, there's not much movement going on along the front line. And I think this is probably why both sides are willing to find a negotiated outcome, a negotiated settlement to this war, because both sides know that right now, under the current circumstances, neither can achieve a major military victory.
So, all right, so I want to circle back. It's maybe I misheard, but it sounded to me like you were saying earlier that the Ukrainians are not that vexed by, at least I should back up. What is exactly in this mineral deal keeps changing from what I can tell, or at least the reporting on what's in it keeps changing.
Yeah.
So the conversations you had a couple of weeks ago might not apply to the current state of the mineral deal, but it sounded like you were saying that the Ukrainians are okay with this mineral deal, and every time I look at it, I'm appalled by it. But so I'm like, where does it stand to your understanding, and how do you come down on it?
Yeah, so when you look at the copies that have been leaked, it looks like extortion, really. I mean, it looks like thuggery, forcing the Ukrainians into lopsided deals at a time when they're most desperate and vulnerable. but let's remember that these are the versions that are leaked.
Right.
This isn't the version that's been agreed. And we do know that from the very beginning, President Zelensky's been a tough negotiator on the minerals deal. He outright rejected the first draft. They were on the verge of signing one until J.D. Vance screwed that up in the Oval Office. And the impression I got, speaking to senior officials in Kyiv right after the Jeddah meetings, was that the Americans want to broaden the scope of this agreement, include more things in it. The Ukrainians, at least to me, seemed quite happy to go along with this because of a number of factors. Some very obvious and some less obvious, or perhaps indirect. The obvious reason is they know they have to have Trump on side. Trump is a transactional guy. They want Trump to get involved in Ukraine, have a stake in Ukraine's future. And there's a belief by many in Kyiv and also by in Washington that Trump can use a mineral deal as political top cover for if and when he goes back to Capitol Hill and tells MAGA Republicans that he needs more funding for Ukraine. He could say, look, don't worry about the money. It's paid for by the Ukrainians. In the same way Mexico paid for the wall, right? You get the headline, you get the talking point, you get the political top cover, but it could work if it got to that point. There's a strong belief in Ukraine that this is one of the reasons why Trump is doing this. I don't know if they've been told this. It's been inferred to them that this is the case, but they certainly take this belief. So they're quite happy to go along with it. Also, reading in between the lines, the Ukrainians know that anything done by executive order with Trump's signature can easily be undone in the future. They don't say this, but this is kind of this is something I observe when I speak to Ukrainians about this. And also, they know better than anyone that the idea that an agreement's going to be signed and the next week rare earth minerals are going to be produced en masse out of the Ukrainian ground is a dream, right? The country's in no state, no condition to conduct large-scale mining operations. The logistical aspects of the country, because of the war, are damaged, if not destroyed, or need to be renovated. It's not precisely known where these minerals are, who has control of the territory where these minerals are. So we're talking years. So the Ukrainians are thinking, okay, we want a closer relationship with the White House. We know that President Trump is not President Biden. He needs a transactional engagement. We're going to engage with him on the minerals deal, which, by the way, was President Zelensky's idea when he came here in September and was promoting his so-called, victory strategy. So we're going to go along with it. If the Americans want to throw in oil and gas, we'll consider it. If they want to, for whatever reason, operate one of our nuclear power plants, which as a layman, I have to say, I have no idea why we would want to do this as Americans. But if I'm not a nuclear energy expert either, but if you're a Ukrainian and you have a nuclear power plant that's occupied by Russia, but you have the possibility of getting that back from Russia, but under the control of an American company or whatever, why wouldn't you want to do that?
Right.
So the Ukrainians are very open-minded with this because they understand the timelines, they understand the political reality they're facing here in Washington. And I got the impression that they're ready to negotiate an even bigger deal. But all these drafts that are floating around, who knows until I see a signature, who knows what the outcome will be.
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, one of the things I've been criticizing Trump about is how he wants press releases and headlines more than he wants substance on a whole bunch of things, right? So he wants a ceasefire that he can call peace.
Exactly.
And he wants to say, and so if Putin honors the ceasefire while Trump is in office, that's as good as Trump getting peace, right? Because then whoever's in next, Trump can say, it was on him. I told you as long as I'm president, Putin would never do this, right? So he gets
a third term.
Right, so he gets vindicated, or that's why I have to stay in office to keep Putin from doing it, whatever, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And this is a point of criticism from me because like the Ukrainians they don't need a press release. They need like guarantees. They need this, they need that. But I hadn't really thought about it that like the press release thing, the headline thing actually can work to the Ukrainian advantage too, because as you say, like you can give Trump the headline without giving him the substance. And that's 90% of what Trump always wants is just the headline and the talking point. I'm glad to hear that the Ukrainians have that level of insight into how Donald Trump operates.
Yeah, and we're seeing this with the tariff debate taking place right now in the U.S. Trump likes the headline tariffs, but you show me a tariff, I'll show you waivers, I'll show you opt-outs, I'll show you exclusions, and the Ukrainians are treating, they're treating this in a similar manner. They know that President Trump is transactional. They want to be a transactional partner. But for those of us who are Ukraine supporters and we understand why what happens in Ukraine matters to us here in the United States, we need to use the next, if there is a ceasefire agreement, which, I am skeptical at this point, but if there is one, we have to use the next few years as breathing space to get Ukraine more equipped, better prepared for when Russia tries again. Because maybe Putin wouldn't try while President Trump is in office if it's President Trump's deal. Maybe he would. Who knows? Depends on the circumstances. I can guarantee you Russia will be back.
Right.
They're not stopping where they are right now. They will be back. In 2014, they couldn't finish the deal. They came back in 2022. They will be back again. We have to be prepared for this. It's in their DNA. It's a colonial mindset. Since Ivan the Terrible in the late 1500s to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, on average, the Russian Empire expanded 55 square miles a day. So the idea that they're stopping at Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk, and Crimea is naive, wishful thinking. So if there is some sort of ceasefire and Ukraine gets this breathing space, we have to take advantage of this because Russia will be taking advantage of their breathing space resulting from any ceasefire. We can't say, okay, it's all done and dusted. It's over. We can pull out of Europe. We can stop engagement with Ukraine. This is my fear with the Trump administration, that they'll be content with a ceasefire that lasts the duration of his term. But that is not how geopolitics work.
Right.
We don't work on like the time. Geopolitics does not operate on the timeline of the U.S. presidential cycle. So we need to be thinking more in the medium to long term about how we make sure Russia can't do this again. And if they do, the consequences are severe for them.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, if being at peace means not having to worry about long-term security, you'd never build another battleship, you'd never build another tank, right? Because like, I'm at peace right now, let's extend this situation indefinitely into the future in a straight line projection, and that's just not how it works. And like, the inability of people to understand that Zelensky has a moral fiduciary obligation about actually securing his country, not just providing a talking point,
Exactly.
is a source of great frustration. But I just want to push back a little. We don't have to get in an argument about tariffs, but like we should tell people we're recording this on April 1. There are no April Fool's pranks going on here. And tomorrow is supposed to be Liberation Day, this day where where Uncle Sam takes a giant ball peen hammer to its own crotch economically.
Pretty much.
And you're not here to talk about tariffs, but when you did say, it's sort of like tariffs, and you can look at them and say, okay, but I see a carve out here and I see an exemption there. That's part of the argument against tariffs, is that they are distorting rational economic thinking by politicizing everything. That's one of the reasons why we got an income tax, which I'm not a huge fan of, but is because it was such a source of corruption in the late 19th century and early 20th century, with every congressman wanting a carve out for their industry or have it applied to the competing industry and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's the feature that Trump likes about them, is that it makes everybody want to ask him for a favor, and then he's empowered to give them favors. Anyway,
I agree. It allows the government to pick winners and losers, which industries to protect. I'm a free trader to my bone. You're not going to find any disagreement with me on that. The point I was trying to make was that, President Trump likes the headline, and whether or not we have these full sanctions or these full tariffs like he's describing, let's see what happens. I mean, the
Right.
markets are not responding positively, that's for sure. And despite what he says, I know he watches what the markets are doing. So yeah, I agree with you. We are on the issue of trade, especially how it pertains to many of our closest allies and partners. We are entering, I would say, a very damaging period.
All right, so that's a good segue. I mean, I'm constantly tempted to bait you into talking about your former employer, the Heritage Foundation's embrace of protectionism, but I'm gonna abstain from doing that. But you brought up the issue of our closest allies. Let's put Canada aside for a second. Let's talk about Europe. You're an Atlanticist, right? I mean, this is like
Yeah.
your career has been spent talking to dudes at NATO about how to better prepare against defending the Fulda Gap and all that kind of crap, right? So how dismayed are you, or are you dismayed about the sudden embrace? And I'll caveat this again. I will stipulate that NATO bought a lot of these problems for themselves by turning a back on their obligations to defense. That core part of the Trump argument is correct. I have nothing but contempt for the argument that Trump is making that case to make NATO stronger, right? That this is really his tough love to improve NATO. I don't believe that. But the tough love part is deserved. That said, you have Mike Lee, used to be one of my favorite senators, going around talking about getting us out of NATO. It is caught on so rapidly, this idea that NATO plays us for suckers and is not in our advantage, that allies of any kind are kind of a suckers game. How lasting do you think the damage is? Or do you think this is another one of these things that once Trump is out, we kind of regress back to the mean a little bit and nature will heal?
Yeah, I on the NATO issue right now, I am not too concerned. Yes, you're hearing things from Elon Musk and Senator Lee and others saying we should leave NATO, but I mean, I haven't heard any senior administration officials say that we should leave NATO. I've read things in the press about leaked memos saying that we should, prioritize the Indo-Pacific and do less in Europe, but keep our nuclear umbrella in Europe, but have the Europeans share more of the burden in terms of like continental defense. I've read all this stuff. But in terms of actually leaving NATO, I haven't seen anything that is alarming yet. Let's not forget that a couple of years ago, the Senate passed a bill making it illegal for a president to just leave NATO, and the Republican co-sponsor for that piece of legislation was Secretary Rubio. But that being said, the rhetoric and the talk about Europe not being important, NATO not being important, shows a certain incoherence with the administration's approach to geopolitics. I mean, let's take the insistence on manufacturing here in America, and what are we producing in America? Well, the latest report came out from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about the state of the transatlantic trade, and in this report, it said that 46 out of 50 states export more to Europe than they do to China. Europe, like Europe as like the EU, as the non-EU countries, Europe as a continent is America's largest export market. So when an American is building a product to be exported, that is a job. And it's more likely or not going to Europe. And right now, NATO is the main security guarantor of what is America's largest export market. So why we would turn our backs to the security and well-being of America's largest export market doesn't make sense. Or the fact that 2/3 of all foreign investment into the United States, and we're talking trillions of dollars, trillions with a T, come from Europe, not from anywhere else. So again, Europe is too important to us economically for us to just say it's no longer important. We don't have to play a role in NATO. Europe is where it is today in terms of its economy and our economic relationship with them because of NATO. Over the years, the U.S. military presence in Europe, coupled with NATO security guarantees, has allowed for economic prosperity to flourish across the continent that not only benefits the U.S. economy, but also the American worker. So when you talk about, well, it's not important, just look at the balance book. It's very important.
So we were talking before we started recording about, what people are calling signal gate, right? The chat thing and all that. And we have a little internal argument at the Dispatch because, the thing is such a friggin' screw up on so many levels that people of goodwill can say, no, the worst part is X. No, it's Y, right? And so we've had a bit of an argument about it. And so I stipulate almost all the criticisms that one can make about the irresponsibility of it, the bad look, like the problem of selective prosecution that you're going to get with the, you're going to put an airman in prison for 5 years or destroy, a Marine's career and life for making smaller mistakes, but you're going to let the Secretary of Defense and all these guys go free. I think that's a big deal. I think the fact that our allies are not going to necessarily, like Israel's pissed about some of their stuff being in this chat and being disclosed. The Five Eyes may not cooperate with us as much as we would like because they're afraid about the hygiene issues. I get all those, and I stipulate to them. Seems to me, though, that if you're a historian writing 50 years from now, and you were looking for a moment where the Europeans, where our allies said, oh crap, they really mean this stuff, right? Where it's like, 'cause there was always a colorable argument that Trump and Vance were saying these things at rallies because that's what the rally wanted to hear. But then behind the scenes, they were saying something different, right? That's how politicians normally operate. Never mind this crowd. But now you're seeing, Vance saying, I think this is a mistake because I don't want to bail out Europe, right? This is the internal conversation. And even Pete Hegseth, who was at the right position on the specific stuff, was saying, look, I agree with you in principle that the Europeans are pathetic and it sucks to help them. You had Stephen Miller saying, let's present them with a bill for services rendered, right? Which is just amazing. Like, if you're a pro-American foreign policy guy in England or in France, and you're looking at this stuff, your job of saying, hey, look, this is all for domestic consumption. This is domestic American politics. They don't really believe this stuff. The alliance is secure. Your argument just got a lot harder to make, right? Because the principals basically all went along with this kind of talk. The vice president flatly basically revealed his contempt for Europe. And, that stuff is the reason why you have, it's not just timing of bombing raids or flight routes that you want to keep classified. Forget the classified legalistic definition stuff. There's a reason why internal conversations about foreign policy are kept secret. Yeah. Because your basic orientation is something that you want your enemies and to a certain extent your friends to keep guessing at, that there's some strategic ambiguity. This removed all of that to a very large degree, and that was the reaction by a lot of people in Europe, at least in the European press that I looked at. But it's kind of been ignored inside the Beltway because, the Beltway wants to treat this as, how did Jeffrey Goldberg, no relation, how did Jeffrey Goldberg's phone number end up in Mike Waltz's phone, which I'm interested in too. But a historian 50 years from now, that's not what they're going to be interested in. And I'm kind of wondering, so how do you, first of all, do you disagree? Yeah. Am I overreading this?
No, I mean, I think I know how his name was added to the chat. I mean, it was somehow done by accident. When Waltz was on television saying that who hasn't had a who hasn't had a contact put in their phone with the wrong name attached to the wrong phone number, I'm like, nobody's had that happen. But what I've had happen, I'm sure many people have, is you have your phone in your pocket and you open up a text message from your contacts because you're fiddling with something in your pocket here. Like this stuff happens all the time. It's just a very unfortunate set of circumstances for Waltz that involved, the editor of
The Atlantic.
The Atlantic. But yeah, I think that's how it happened. I don't think anyone was trying to dupe Waltz or trick anyone. I think that's probably how it happened. But yeah, from a personal point of view, I'm kind of interested in that. But you're right, from a historian's point of view, or from, if you're an allied government or an adversarial government and their intelligence community, the information gleaned from that relatively short text exchange is gold dust.
Right.
I mean, you even as like an outside observer working at a think tank in Washington, knowing what I think I know about certain people, I was able to validate or maybe adjust some of my views and assessments. It was interesting that they, the vice president, he demonstrated a lack of understanding about how interdependent the global economy is. He's sharing statistics about, or he's worried about what percent of this trade goes to Europe, as if trade only just goes to Europe or component parts just go to Europe and then aren't part of something else that's linked to the U.S. economy. So it showed a very simplistic view of the interdependency of the global economy. Stephen Miller's comments about making Europeans pay, again, showed a very simplistic, naive worldview of how this stuff works. But meanwhile, Pete Hegseth was showing, more of a traditional Republican worldview, that freedom of navigation matters, the global commons matter, sticking up to Iranian proxies matter. And, yes, he did agree with Vance about Europe, but I think that was actually Hegseth playing the politics.
No, he could have been being diplomatic to try to keep Vance on team. Right? Yeah, that's possible. Yeah.
But so I think that was quite telling in itself. But yeah, I mean, the fact that it was done that way, and with the whole debate about whether it was classified or not. I mean, I was once a junior Army officer, and any information like that that would have times and timestamps and the types of weapons used
in advance of the battle. Yeah,
it has to be secret at a minimum, if not top secret.
Yeah.
So that's alarming. How everyone on that chain thought that conversation was okay. Maybe someone raised a concern like offline or in a parallel chat. We don't have access to that. And the White House is doing everything they can to move on from this situation. But it was a shocking display. And it was very telling about who thinks what inside that administration.
Right. But but I guess the point we were talking about earlier about Zelensky, right? Where Zelensky can't agree to just a photo op deal or a headline deal or a PR press release deal, right? He can't agree just to a talking point, because the talking point won't keep Russian tanks from crossing his border. It won't protect his people for a time horizon longer than the next, the remainder of Trump's term. He has to think about this as like, what is in the abiding interest of the existence of my country, right? That kind of thing. It's a different time frame. It's a geopolitical time frame. It's all that. It seems to me, I compared it in a column I wrote to, the entire plot of The Godfather unfolds because Sonny reveals to the Turk, to Sollozzo, what he's really thinking about this deal. And the Godfather slaps him and says, "What are you doing? You never tell anybody outside the family what you're thinking," right?
Yeah.
We told the world sort of what these guys are thinking, and that if you're a planner about long-term strategic, national security stuff in Germany and Poland, in France, and you look at this, you might say, sure, it's possible that we can wait out the Trump administration and things will get back to normal. On the flip side, you now have a much greater degree of uncertainty about the reliability of the United States going forward. Vance, I think, is overblown about his chances of being the next president. We can get into rank punditry if you want, but they're not zero, right?
Yeah.
And And if he thinks that way, and Trump is still Trump, and the party continues to Trumpify, it just seems to me that this was a moment. I mean, I'm not trying to overread it. I think there are other interpretations and all that, but like, if it was a data point for a lot of Europeans to say, okay, we literally cannot bet our continued national security entirely on America, because it's just they're we now know even internally they're talking about how they don't like the idea of bailing us out. They're not our friends. And that strikes me as like a significant thing.
Well, J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller certainly take that view. Again, like I said, Hegseth took a more of a conventional view, and so did Waltz. But let's not forget what this also. The one person who wasn't in that chat
was Donald Trump.
We still learn a lot about his views, President Trump, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that it was on his initiative, like he wanted to do this, and then you had this questioning of his views inside this chat was also very telling. But when it comes to president, so I don't think what Stephen Miller says about billing Europe matters in transatlantic relations, because other than being like in these chat groups and commentating inside meetings or whatever, I don't think he's going to be directing policy on transatlantic issues. What matters, because Ukraine is such a crucial issue for President Trump, really what all that matters is what President Trump says and does when it comes to Europe. And, so far the Europeans have cracked the code with President Trump. Those visits by Macron, Starmer, the golf tournament over the weekend with President Stubb of Finland, the new Secretary General, the way he's engaging with Trump, the interpersonal relations between many of Europe's leaders and President Trump are far better in the second term so far than they were in the first term, when some EU commissioners were entering Twitter battles with President Trump. Others were going on television saying certain things. The Europeans have figured out how to engage and work with Trump. And I think this will be what weathers the turbulence that we might have in the transatlantic community between now and the end of his term.
I hope you're right.
Me too. But you never know. You never know. I mean, it could, depending on how Ukraine plays out, depending on what happens with Russia and Trump, and the burgeoning relationship that we're seeing emerge there, or what happens at the upcoming NATO summit, this could all end sideways. But right now, I would say so far, so good.
Okay, can you make that case about how Steve Witkoff has handled his job?
No, I can't. Look, I honestly, I don't know much about him until he was appointed. I didn't know much about him, if anything. And I actually, he comes across, I've never met him. But when I see him do these interviews, whether it's on Tucker or on Fox or whatever, he comes across as a nice guy. Some people, not everyone, but there's some people in the MAGA world who can come across as pretty nasty. Mm-hmm. He comes across as a nice guy, and I think that he will be, in 5 to 10 years, he will be deeply embarrassed by some of the YouTube videos that will be out there, because he has taken hook, line, and he's, in my opinion, unfairly been thrown into the lion's den, saying, you're going to be my point guy to Putin, without any background or expertise or knowledge about what the situation is, which is evident by the way he talks on interviews. And he's been told to do this, and he's taking hook, line, and sinker whatever Putin tells him. And then he comes back to the US and he goes on television and says, Putin told me that he had to shoot down some of his own drones that were heading to Ukraine because of the ceasefire agreement. I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm not.
That he went to church to pray for Donald Trump.
He went to church to pray. He will stop at Ukraine, or he'll stop at the 4 regions that he partially occupies now in Ukraine.
Those referendums were legitimate. Yeah.
Yeah, no knowledge of the fact that these referendums took place literally under gunpoint, literally after hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of ethnic Ukrainians who once lived in these lands were forced to flee. But he doesn't know any of this. He doesn't know the history, and he's told by Putin, "Well, we had a referendum; it was free and fair." The last free and fair referendum in Ukraine was in '91, when the country decided. It was December 1st of '91. They had a vote. Do you want to be part of the newly established Russian Federation, or do you want to be independent? Every region of Ukraine, including Crimea, had a majority voting for independence, like an independent Ukraine. Like, take a oblast like Kherson, where, the last census that was done was about 2003, I think. And then Russia moved in 2014 to eastern Ukraine. We're talking 80-90% of people in that census were ethnic Ukrainians in Kherson. And now you're telling me that a referendum was held in 2022 and 98% or whatever people want to be part of the Russian Federation? Of course this is bogus. But because he doesn't have a background in this, he's been kind of like duped into thinking that what Putin is saying is correct. And I kind of feel bad for him, because I think he comes across as a smart and as a nice guy, but he's just, I would say, in over his head right now when it comes to dealing with Russia.
Yeah, I personally don't get it. Like, I get, Trump likes to have his friends in places, and maybe this Witkoff guy is a great deal maker in commercial real estate, or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure he is.
But it's like with Pete Hegseth. I don't think Pete Hegseth was the right pick for DOD. I don't think he's the worst pick of that crowd, and he knows enough to know what he doesn't know to a certain extent. But if you're going to do that, you put a number 2 person in there who knows the where the dust bunnies accumulate in the corners of the office, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And that Witkoff doesn't have some PhD nerd who says, you do know that Russians are the most famous bad faith, brilliant negotiators in all of the last 150 years, right? I mean, read any book about Kissinger and you would know this, and
that you're dealing with a president in the Kremlin that has devoted his life to manipulation, to undermining U.S. interests at every turn. Not once since 1999 has Russia shown, since Putin came to power in 1999, has Russia shown that it could be a credible or trustworthy partner. And now all of a sudden we think they can be. It's just very naive. And because I think he's a smart man, I think he's going to quickly figure this out. And I think he'll be embarrassed by some of the video interviews that he has done. But I think President Trump is also starting to get frustrated with Putin as well, when it comes to the way the Kremlin is dragging its feet on bringing negotiated settlement to this war. I think we're starting to see signs of that.
So I give you a, I think you're giving Witkoff a little more benefit of the doubt than I would have. I think he's got marching orders that are contrary to paying granular attention to the facts. But you may be right, and you may be right that he's also a nice guy. I mean, it's all pure speculation. But on the Trump being frustrated with Putin thing, the inside the Beltway speculation is that, part of that came across in that Kristen Welker phone call Sunday morning, where he also talked about how he's not opposed to a third term and all this kind of stuff. And so the inside the Beltway speculation is that some of that stuff is so to change the subject from the Signalgate stuff. But put that aside. The stick that Trump wants to use to induce Putin to cooperate is secondary sanctions on Russian oil. Now, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I've been trying to stay abreast of this kind of stuff. That strikes me as borderline pointless, and that the better stick is to say, all right, the aid's going back on. Ukraine's going to get more weapons until you guys take these negotiations seriously. is this secondary sanction thing, like we're going to start sanctioning China for buying Russian oil? Is that
Yeah.
going to work?
Actually, so in terms of Russia's two main energy exports, oil and natural gas, oil is definitely the lifeline of the Russian economy, and it's also the one that has had the least amount of attention or sanctions on. A lot of the gas, a lot of the, it's also a matter of how you transport this stuff. A lot of natural gas is piped.
Right.
So, for example, a lot of the piped gas from Russia to Europe has been cut off, or sanctions have been applied to it. But oil is more easily moved, which makes it more of a global commodity, where you can, like, to put gas on a tanker, you have to liquefy it. Hugely expensive process, which you don't even turn a profit on unless that ship travels about, I don't know, 1,500 miles, right?
Right.
With oil, you can just put it on a tanker, put it in a pipe, put it on a train. You can just move it around very easily. And Russia's been able to find new markets easier for its oil than it could for its gas, because the idea that they're going to build a pipeline through Siberia to China overnight isn't realistic, right? Yes, he does have a point about the oil, but it has to be part of a larger plan, which includes what you mentioned, Jonah, about rearming and equipping the Ukrainians. It has to be part of a bigger plan. But President Trump knows that he has to have President Putin on board and President Zelensky on board to get a deal. This is important to President Trump personally, because he wants this thing to be part of his legacy of peace building and ending wars or whatnot. But my view is that Russia will continue to drag this out. They will want to drag out any tangible ceasefire agreement to around the same time, or perhaps even the same week as the NATO summit in June, because the Kremlin wants to take the focus away from NATO, make it all about Russia and the ceasefire that they're finally agreeing to, peeling Trump away from Europe, maybe even forcing a meeting with Putin the same week as the NATO summit, which the optics would not look very good. Right. So I think they're trying to drag this out to the NATO summit to create problems for cohesion inside the alliance. This deadline of April 20th, I am not holding my breath. We don't seem to be anywhere close to the Russians agreeing to any significant ceasefire, even a temporary one. And right now, it's quite clear that the main obstacle to peace is Russia. So the next few weeks will be telling on which way President Trump is going to go. Either he's serious about bringing this war to some sort of just conclusion, or he's not. And if he's serious about it, he's going to have to start turning the heat up on Russia. Because right now, a lot of the pressure has been on Ukraine because this has been easier for them. Right. It's going to be more difficult to put the pressure on Russia. So if he's serious, we'll start seeing pressure on Russia. If he's not serious, we're not going to see pressure on Russia, and we'll see this thing being dragged out further.
All right, so I'm interested, because I've talked to some people about the secondary sanction thing about the oil stuff, and I grant your point that oil is a lifeline for the Russian economy. What are the mechanics of actually making that bite, given how Russia has been so effective in working around so many of the sanctions already? I mean, like, so many of the predictions from 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago about how, the Western Europe will not have come up with a substitute for Russian gas. It kind of did. I remember in the very beginning, everyone was like, crypto is going to really help Russia. It turns out it really helped Ukraine. That the sanctions are going to be, the Biden world was like all in. There's a whole 60 Minutes thing about how these sanctions are going to cripple the Russian economy. And it turns out, no, it turned Kazakhstan into this massive middleman between, Germany and Russia. And so I'm sure you could make oil more expensive for Russia, more difficult for Russia to sell. But I'm just skeptical that you can do it at the kind of scale quickly that would
Yes.
force Russia to the negotiating table.
That's the point. And that's the point with all of these sanctions, quickly. Sanctions are not immediate because there's any economic sanction, any especially with energy sector or even the non-energy sector, there's already stuff in the pipe. The Russians have, quite literally and also figuratively, the Russians have over the past 3 years figured out ways to get around economic sanctions or mitigate the impact of sanctions. I think for too long we've viewed sanctions as like the panacea or like the silver bullet for many of our geopolitical challenges. They have to be a tool in the toolkit, but they can't be the toolkit itself. So in the longer term, the jury's still out on how effective the current sanctions regime is on Russia. There are many indications, economic indicators showing that, by the end of this year, the Russian economy could be in trouble. The same with secondary sanctions on oil. We may not see the benefits of these sanctions for months. And in the meantime, the Russians will find workarounds and everything else. They will perhaps sell it, on the black market at a lower rate like the Iranians do to China. They sell below market price, but enough where they still turn a profit. There are ways that they could get around this. So it has to be an all-encompassing approach. You can't just say, okay, secondary sanctions, now Russia come and negotiate, because it's not going to work. If it does work, it'll take months to work. So it'll be interesting to see how, the White House deals with this. But right now, the leader who looks strong is President Zelensky, because his popularity is now higher than ever in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Another president that looks strong is Putin, because he's dragging this out. He's defying what Trump says. 30-day ceasefire on energy infrastructure, forget it. 30-day ceasefire on the Black Sea, well, and not until these preconditions are met. He's looking strong. Right now, President Trump is the one looking weak. He's the one looking like he's not in control of these negotiations, because we keep hearing for months, oh, well, I'll end this war in 24 hours. Now we all laugh about that. Even Trump agrees it was, he wasn't speaking, he wasn't being true, exact.
Take him seriously, not literally.
Exactly.
All that crap.
But even now, it's like we had 30 days, then we had by April 20th, then we had 120 days. I mean, what is it? If you're serious about getting these two parties to the negotiating table, you're going to have to put pressure on both, not just on one. Otherwise, you look out of control, and frankly, you look weak compared to Putin. So let's see what happens.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to ask you about this effort that the Russians are pushing about an interim government in Ukraine.
Yeah,
what the hell it's the most BS, kind of like lame, Hail Mary we've seen in a while.
Well, the Russians have these maximalist goals still for Ukraine, where they're, the long-term goal is regime change in Kyiv with a pro-Russian puppet government. They know they're not going to get that right away. God willing, they'll never get it, but they're certainly going to try. And now their latest thing is, like, they've gone from calling for demanding elections as if this is a matter for the Russian Federation, or looking at Russia's track record of free and fair elections. It's not as if they have much they could say on this with much credibility. So they've gone from demanding elections in Ukraine to now suggesting that the whole country should be put under some sort of international administration, which is even more absurd. And I don't know what President Putin is thinking, because it seems so unrealistic. My only guess is that this is this will be his starting point, and then he'll negotiate from that point. President Trump does this. This is like an Art of the Deal, his book, where he talks about starting up here, then you end up in a place more in the middle. But on the point about regime change in Kyiv and elections, right now, no opposition party in parliament has called for martial law to be lifted. Nobody wants elections right now in Ukraine, even the opposition. If there are elections held right now under the wartime conditions, not only will it be dangerous for Ukrainians, but also easy for Russia to manipulate
Right.
the situation, especially with, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians on the front lines. And people say, well, we did it in the Civil War. I hear this argument all the time. I'm like, well, guess what? General Lee couldn't send a drone to Boston during the Civil War. I mean, my God. That's one of the worst arguments I hear. But no doubt that when martial law is lifted, the country will have elections. They're just waiting for the right time for this. And also, on the issue of martial law, this is a piece of legislation that originates from the parliament.
Right.
That's then voted and passed on in parliament and signed into law by the president. It's not as if President Zelensky has unilateral authority to institute martial law. But with all the misinformation and propaganda we have in certain corners of our media, you would think that President Zelensky is this dictator who is demanding martial law, preventing elections from happening, when nobody, opposition or government or ruling party, wants to have elections right now.
Right. Just to be clear to the listeners that don't get it, when you have martial law, you're not allowed to have elections, right? It's
There's a law based on Ukraine's constitution that prevents certain things from happening under martial law, including elections.
Right. All right. So just very quickly, a couple little things. One, I have a couple friends who are sort of in the same space as you, who were telling me recently that they hear that Trump in private is constantly bringing up how he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. Have you heard this?
I haven't heard that as explicit as you just described it. But come on.
It doesn't shock you either.
Yeah. Do you think for a second President Trump does not want a Nobel Peace Prize? Of course he does. Especially after, President Obama got it for like literally doing nothing.
Yeah. For existing.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. For existing, So I have no doubt in my mind that Trump would love to have that feather in his cap. And I think this is one of the main reasons why he's keen on a deal. This is the main motivating factor for him. It's his legacy. It's the possibility of a Nobel Peace Prize. He would love that more than anything. And this is why I think he's been willing to tolerate quite a lot from both Putin and even Zelensky. I mean, look at what happened in the Oval Office. That was an embarrassing moment in America's history. And later that afternoon, President Trump, walking to the helicopters, was asked by the cameras about the meeting. And he could have used that opportunity to turn the screw on Zelensky. He could have said, I can't work with this guy. He needs to apologize to me, apologize to the American people, and someone else needs to take over because I cannot deal with this guy. Instead, he didn't say any of that. He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't say Zelensky had to go. What he said was, whenever President Zelensky is serious about a peace deal, he can come back to me. Which showed me that President Trump knows he depends on Zelensky to get a deal, whether Trump likes it or not. Same with Putin. Putin and Trump have a phone call. Allegedly, a ceasefire is agreed. The Russian readout says a 30-day ceasefire on energy infrastructure. The American readout says a 30-day ceasefire on energy and infrastructure. Big damn difference there with that conjunction. Right. And within like hours, Russia's already bombing energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And what does Trump do about it? Nothing. Because he knows that he could be pushed by Putin to a certain point because he depends on Putin because he wants this peace deal. The question is, what is President Trump's limit? What is his threshold on how much he's willing to be dragged along by Putin or pushed around when it comes to these negotiations? And time will tell. But yeah, I think he does win a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, look, I mean,
I wouldn't mind a Nobel Peace Prize.
I like the cash that goes with it, but
yeah, who's going to turn that down?
No, I mean, like we sometimes forget that, like Richard Neustadt, who's like one of the major political scientists about the presidency, and part of his point is that a lot of things that presidents do, which is good, is because they care about their long-term legacy. And like that can apply to Donald Trump too in positive
Of
ways,
course.
you know. But all right, so we brought it up, and it just occurs to me, listeners are going to actually want to know, even though it's pretty far back in the rearview mirror. If you were going to assign blame for, we don't like to curse on this podcast, for the fecal festival that was that Oval Office meeting, where do you come down on it? Like, how much do you put to Zelensky? How much do you put to Trump? How much do you put to Vance?
Vance has the most of the blame. I mean, he's the vice president speaking from the sofa, which is unorthodox in itself. He has a certain constituency that he's playing to, that he wanted to show he was going to be tough on Zelensky. And all of this was compounded by the fact that Zelensky probably couldn't keep up with English being his third language.
Yeah.
He should. Why he does not use a translator, I do not know. He should have used a translator. In any contentious meeting you think you're going to have, use a translator. Why? Because the person that's probably going to be contentious is speaking to the interpreter.
Right.
And the interpreter is speaking to you. So that immediately takes some of the sting out of the conversation.
Right. Well, also, I mean, just to add to this, I talked to somebody about this. It's also, you know, Putin speaks a bunch of languages, but he likes to use translators because he can understand what the question is, and then he still waits to hear the translation. So it gives him like an extra 2 minutes to think about his answer, you know, which is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, what I do think President Zelensky was ambushed. Is there an argument that he could still have handled the situation differently? You know, perhaps, of course he could have, but considering the circumstances and also knowing he has a constituency back at home and that he has, you know, he probably wasn't able to articulate in the same way in English or understand the nuances in English. I think that played into it in a major way. But thankfully, we've all seemed to move on. We've moved on from this. I mean, the impression I got is the Ukrainians have moved on. You know, President Trump has invited President Zelensky back to the White House at some point. I think this is, you know, so I think this is now, thankfully, a water under the bridge and hopefully a learning point for everyone.
Yeah, I'm basically with you. I think there's a 20 to 25% of blame to give to Zelensky for just sort of it's an Aesopian problem. Like the scorpion shouldn't sting you, but it's a scorpion, so you should be ready for scorpion bites, right? And I hate the bending of all of our standards to take account for who Trump is, but like Trump is who he is, and he's the president, so like at some level you have to do some of that, particularly if you're trying to save your country. But only major thing other than the unpresidential spectacle of the spat and all that stuff that I hold really against Trump is most Oval Office photo ops, you know, what they call them sprays. They're like 5 minutes. Take your pictures, smile, and then you can have contentious fights, but you do it. It's sort of like my point about like with the Sonny Corleone problem was like, you know, you can have fights, but you don't telegraph them to the world. And that meeting should never have been 45 minutes. He liked the visuals and he let it go on too long. But then most of it, I just blame Vance. I think Vance did it. I don't know that he was planning the entire time to do it or anything like that. But like the only way that for Vance to have been responsible, the only thing that Vance should have done in terms of speaking from the couch, which he shouldn't have done, is to say, gentlemen, they're waiting for us at lunch. Let's continue this frank exchange of ideas inside. And that sending us managing up. He didn't do that. He instead decided to poke the bear. And, you know, it was a utter embarrassment.
Yeah, it was. And there was no way out for Zelensky. He couldn't have been the one that said, okay, time's up. Thanks, everyone. Let's go have lunch. You know, he couldn't have done that. And it did get heated, and it was very unfortunate. I mean, you know, we were at Hudson Institute. We were supposed to host
I know.
Zelensky after and that got canceled. We had, you know, almost 200 people, Secret Service locked down the building. So from a logistical point of view, that was a nightmare. But you know, it was an unfortunate incident. that I feel like everyone has moved on, and hopefully it won't happen again, because nobody will put themselves in that circumstance again. That,
Yeah.
like, you'll know what to expect.
Yeah. They'll have contingencies the next time.
Yeah.
All right. Just last question. I know it's not normally we try to end on some momentous big wrap up thing, but I wanted to ask earlier, what the hell is going on with the North Koreans in Russia? Like, are they pure cannon fodder?
Yeah.
Are we getting more of them? Are the like the thing that worries me, like you talk to South Koreans, the thing that worries them is that North Korea hasn't fought a war in 60 years or whatever it is, and the last thing they want is for the North Korean military to actually get trained up and get battle hardened in any way. Is that happening, or are they just all being mowed down?
It's a mix of all of that. So this was one of the issues that we were interested in when we visited Ukraine, and we talked about the North Koreans quite a bit in our meetings. The impression I got was, at first, they were, I don't know if they were meant to be used as cannon fodder, but they behaved like cannon fodder.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of it was just a lack of exposure to 21st century things.
Right.
So, like with the FPV, the first person view drones, that both sides are strapping explosives to, flying them into people. Some of these North Koreans had never seen such a thing. So they would see this drone like hovering towards them and like just stare at it. Like,
they wouldn't scatter. Yeah.
But they took heavy losses in the thousands. But also we were told that they're quick learners, and that they adapted on the battlefield and they became, a decent fighting force. Now, I don't think that's an attribute necessarily for North Korean soldiers to have. I think that's one of the key attributes of soldiering.
Right.
You learn, you adapt, or you don't survive. So North Korean soldiers, like Russian soldiers, like Ukrainian soldiers, like American, like British soldiers, you will adapt on the battlefield to survive. And that's what they did. There's no indication that these North Koreans have been actually used inside Ukraine's borders, but we were told that there's no reason to assume that they wouldn't be, now that the Kursk operation is largely over. Most of these North Korean soldiers were used to take back the territory inside Russia that Ukraine had captured last August. So the Ukrainians are assuming that these North Korean soldiers will be used at other points along the front line inside Ukraine. But the big strategic question is, what is North Korea getting in terms of missile technology, nuclear weapons technology? There was a particular concern I've been hearing about Russia sharing technology to improve North Korea's submarine launched nuclear missile capability. We won't know the answer to that for a while. And, God forbid, we may find out the answer to what Russia is helping North Korea with when it's too late.
Yeah.
But, the North Koreans aren't doing this for free. They are getting combat training, but the numbers are relatively low when you look at the size of the North Korean army. So I think the big benefit is probably from shared technology and other military capabilities that Russia can then provide North Korea.
Yeah, you'd think China would want some prohibitions on some of that, right? Like if China wanted North Korea to have state-of-the-art tech on nuclear or any of that kind of stuff, it could have given it to it a long time ago, right? I mean, and it is on their border. But you don't hear
It's on
much about
Russia's
that.
border too. I mean,
Yeah.
and there's a long history of Pyongyang being the client of Moscow.
Yeah.
So that might be baked into Beijing's thinking.
Yeah.
Already, it's not like out of the ordinary that that Russia is helping North Korea. So that may help.
All right, Luke Coffey, thanks for coming back. It's been great to have you, and I love your sunny, upbeat optimism about everything. And
I try. Someone has to be optimistic.
And hope to have you back again soon for even more optimism.
Thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure, and I really enjoyed our conversation.